28.1 degrees Celsius. That's about 82.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now here's the strange part. That wasn't the daytime high. That was the coolest moment of the entire day, the middle of the night, in a city called Yongin in South Korea. Most people set their air conditioning colder than that before they go to sleep. And a few hours after that reading, the same city hit a temperature no thermometer had ever recorded in that country's history. On the other side of the planet, in that exact same week, 40 million Americans were being warned about temperatures climbing past 110 degrees. 2 continents, 1 week. Records breaking on both sides of the world at the same time. Most people are going to ask if one single thing caused both of these events. The real answer is more interesting than that, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the nighttime number matters more than anything you saw in a headline. Let's start with that number again, because it deserves a second look. 28.1 degrees Celsius in Yongin, South Korea, recorded during the darkest, coolest hours of the night. To put that in perspective, think about your own bedroom. Most people sleep comfortably somewhere between 18 and 22 degrees Celsius. This city never even got close to that range. Not once, not even at 3 in the morning when the sun had been gone for hours. That's the kind of number that sits quietly in a weather report while everyone's attention goes somewhere else. But it's actually one of the most important clues in this entire story, and we'll come back to why later. For now, let's look at what happened in the hours after that reading. Under a sun with nothing to block it, no clouds, no rain, nothing standing in its way, Yangon's temperature climbed all the way to 41.4 degrees Celsius. That's a little over 106 degrees Fahrenheit. And here's why that number matters so much. It became the highest temperature ever officially recorded in South Korea since the country started keeping modern weather records. Not the highest for that week, not the highest for that month, the highest ever measured in the entire history of tracking weather in that country. This didn't happen out of nowhere. The final days of July had already been building towards something like this. Just days earlier, Yangon crossed 40 degrees Celsius for the very first time in the history of Korea's national weather network. And it did that during July, which almost never happens, because the hottest weather in Korea usually shows up in August instead. Around the same time, a port city called Busan hit 38.8 degrees Celsius, breaking a record that had stood since 2016 in a city where weather records go back more than 100 years. Then Yangon broke 40 degrees again the next day, and again the day after that. 3 days in a row above 40 degrees, each one adding another line to the record book. On the third day, at just after 1 in the afternoon, the temperature hit that historic 41.4 mark, breaking a national record that had survived since 2018, a record that had held strong through 8 full summers before this one came along and ended it. Numbers on a page are one thing. What was actually happening on the ground tells a different story. In the province where Yangon sits, health officials had already logged more than 100 heat-related illness cases before the record even fell. On farms across the region, the losses were even harder to look at. More than 10,000 animals died from the heat, most of them chickens, along with thousands of pigs. In one area, farmers got so desperate that they started using drones to spray heat-blocking coating onto the roofs of pig barns, just trying to buy their animals a few extra degrees of relief. The government responded by raising the national heat warning to the second highest level out of 4, with warnings active across roughly half of the country's weather zones. To understand how serious that is, the highest level of warning in Korea only gets triggered when the heat index passes 38 degrees Celsius, or when the daily high hits 39. On a single day during this stretch, 17 different areas in the southern part of the country hit that threshold at the same time. So by the time this heat wave reached its peak, it wasn't just one broken record, it was a chain of them, each one building on the last, happening faster than the country's weather system had ever recorded before. And the number that started all of it, the one that mattered most, wasn't the dramatic afternoon high everyone talked about. It was that quiet 28.1 degree reading in the middle of the night, the one that never should have happened, and the one we're going to come back to later in this video. Because it turns out to be the key to understanding why this entire summer has been so different. Picture 2 blankets thrown on top of a bed, one on top of the other. Now imagine both of those blankets are made of air, sitting miles above a country, pressing straight down. And that's actually a fair way to picture what was sitting above Korea while those records kept falling, and once you understand it, the whole heat wave stops feeling random and starts feeling like simple physics. Weather scientists in Korea have been open about what caused this, and it's not the usual summer setup. There were 2 separate systems of heavy air stacked on top of each other at the same time. Down low, closer to the ground, sat a warm, wet system that normally controls Korean summers, the kind that rolls in off the ocean. But above that, higher up in the sky, sat a second system, this one hot and dry, pushing in from a completely different direction. When these 2 layers stack directly on top of one another, the air trapped between them has nowhere to go but down. And air that sinks does something specific. It squeezes together as it drops, and squeezing air makes it hotter, the same way a bicycle pump gets warm when you push it fast. At the same time, all that sinking air kills off any clouds trying to form. No clouds means nothing blocking the sun. Full sunlight hitting the ground. Every single hour, day after day, with no rain to cool things down or slow it down. This is where it helps to understand the size of what we're actually talking about. A heat dome isn't a small hot patch sitting over one city like fog rolling in. It's a massive dome of heavy air that can stretch across an entire country, sometimes even half a continent, and it can sit in that same spot for days without moving. The sinking motion inside it happens so slowly you'd never even feel it as wind, but it's happening across millions of square miles of sky all at once. And it does two jobs at the same time. It heats the air through pressure and it blocks anything from coming in to break the pattern. Storm systems that would normally sweep through and cool things down get pushed around the edges instead, like a boulder sitting in the middle of a river, forcing the water to flow around it. That's why heat domes last for days or weeks instead of just a few hours. There's one more piece that explains why the southeast corner of Korea specifically became the epicenter of this. Wind blowing in from the west has to cross over Korea's mountain ranges to get there. As air climbs up one side of a mountain, it drops its moisture as rain. Then, as that same air comes down the other side, it arrives drier and warmer than when it started. Yangin sits right in the path of that effect. It's not an accident that the national record happened there instead of in a bigger, more well-known city. The shape of the land itself picked the winner. Now shift your attention west, across the sea, because Japan spent that same stretch of July dealing with something so extreme that the country's weather agency had to invent a brand new word just to describe it. Earlier this year, Japan's meteorological agency added an official new heat category to its language. The new term applies to any day that hits 40 degrees Celsius or higher, and it sits one full level above the existing term used for dangerously hot days. The agency chose this new word through a nationwide public survey that pulled in nearly 500,000 responses, and one term won by a wide margin. It's the first new heat category Japan has added since 2007, and that detail alone tells you something important. A weather agency doesn't invent new vocabulary for something rare. It invents new vocabulary for something that has become common enough that it finally needs its own name. The record backs that up perfectly. From the start of Japan's weather records all the way up to 2017, days hitting 40 degrees or higher happened exactly 3 times, spread out across roughly a century and a half. Since 2018, they've happened every single year without exception. And during this particular stretch, the country recorded 5 days in a row at or above 40 degrees, the longest streak like it Japan has ever measured. On the 5th day, a city called Nino hit 40.8 degrees, while heat warnings were active in 37 of Japan's 47 regions at the exact same time. 2 countries, 2 very different mechanisms behind the heat, but the same result showing up in the same week. And that pattern is exactly what makes this story worth paying attention to. Here's a question most people never think to ask. When someone dies from extreme heat, where do you picture it happening? Most people imagine someone working outside, maybe a construction site, a farm, someone stuck out in direct sun for hours. But the real numbers coming out of Japan tell a completely different story, and it's the kind of detail that gets buried under all the record-breaking headlines. During the worst week of Japan's heat wave, 14 people died from heat-related causes, and almost 11,000 people were rushed to hospitals by ambulance. That number alone was more than double what the same week looked like the year before, and it was the first time weekly hospital numbers had ever crossed 10,000 since the country started tracking heat season data. Now here's the part that changes the whole picture. People aged 65 and older made up well over half of those cases, and the single most common place for a heat stroke to begin wasn't outdoors at all. It was inside a private home, not a job site, not a stadium, a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen. The following week got even worse, with close to 19,000 people hospitalized and 45 deaths, and hundreds of those patients needed weeks of treatment afterward. Japan's own disaster agency, an agency that normally reserves serious language for earthquakes and typhoons, started calling this heat wave a disaster, using that exact word. This wasn't happening in a country unprepared for heat, either. Japan already loses more than 1,000 people a year to heat-related causes, and the country has a national goal to cut that number in half within the next few years. Heat exposure cost the country close to $1.5 billion working hours last year alone, with an economic hit estimated near $50 billion, most of it landing on factories, construction, and retail businesses. And here's the detail that matters most. Around 80% of Japan's heat stroke deaths happen to people over 65, and in cities like Tokyo, roughly 90% of those deaths happen indoors. That's often not a story about whether someone owns an air conditioner, it's a story about whether they felt they could afford to run it. Now take all of that and cross the ocean. Because while Korea and Japan were breaking records, the United States was writing its own chapter in the same story, just with a different shape. July of 2026 is on pace to become the hottest month ever recorded across the entire United States, beating out the previous record set back in 2012. And this didn't happen because of one single heat wave. It happened in waves, one stacking on top of the other. Around the start of July, a massive dome of hot air settled over the eastern two-thirds of the country, putting more than 200 million Americans under extreme heat warnings at once. A second wave hit the northern Rockies about a week later, and it caught meteorologists off guard. Cities in Montana and Wyoming hit temperatures they had never recorded before. One city hit 111 degrees Fahrenheit. Another hit 115. And in each case, the new record didn't just barely beat the old one, it beat it by 2 degrees or more, which in weather terms isn't a small nudge, it's a significant jump. Then came the Southwest. Salt Lake City recorded its highest temperature in over 150 years of weather records. Death Valley hit 120 degrees, the hottest reading anywhere in the country all year. And by the middle of the month, more than 1,400 daily heat records had already fallen across the country, stacked on top of another 1,000 that fell the month before. This wasn't a random hot week showing up out of nowhere either. The entire year had been building toward it. Earlier in the year, 10 different states recorded their warmest ever reading for that time of year. And by early spring, cities in the Southwest were already hitting temperatures that normally don't show up until deep summer. So when the July record for the whole country gets confirmed, it won't look like one sudden spike on a flat line. It will look like the highest point on a slope that had already been climbing since the start of the year. There's a question sitting underneath everything we've covered so far, and it's the one almost everyone jumps to first. If Korea, Japan, and the United States all broke heat records in the same week, doesn't that mean one single thing is causing all of it? The honest answer has two parts, and skipping either one would leave you with a story that sounds simple but isn't actually true. Here's the first part. The Pacific Ocean is currently going through a strong weather pattern known as El Nino, officially declared earlier this year and expected to keep getting stronger through the rest of the year. This pattern is a real and powerful force. It moves enormous amounts of heat out of the ocean and into the atmosphere, and years with a strong version of this pattern almost always run hotter across the entire planet compared to the years around them. That much is solid and well understood. But here's the part that often gets left out, and it's just as important. This ocean pattern did not build the stacked high-pressure system sitting over Korea. It did not build the heat dome that sat over Montana and Wyoming either. Those were two completely separate weather setups, forming an ocean apart from each other, following their own local physics. If you could somehow remove this ocean pattern from the picture entirely, both of those heat events could still have happened on their own. Heat domes are not rare or mysterious. They happen every single year. There's also a timing problem with the simple version of this story. This ocean pattern's biggest effect on global temperatures usually shows up the year after it peaks. Not during the summer, it's still building, which means its strongest influence hasn't even arrived yet. So what actually connects Korea and Montana isn't one weather system reaching across the planet. It's something quieter than that. Every heat dome forming right now is forming on top of an ocean and an atmosphere that are already warmer than they were a few decades ago. The weather pattern itself hasn't changed. It's doing the exact same job it always did. It's just starting from a higher floor than before. A setup that might have created a hot week 30 years ago now creates a record-breaking week instead. And the record doesn't get broken by a small amount, it gets broken by a full degree or two. That's not a dramatic, exciting mechanism. It's a quiet, almost boring one. But it's exactly why so many of these records are landing at the same time. Korea's own weather agency has actually measured this shift directly, finding that heat waves now start 10 to 30 days earlier than they did 50 years ago and end about 10 days later. The heat didn't just get more intense, the entire season stretched longer on both ends. Which brings everything back to that first number from the very beginning of this video, the one that started all of this. The daytime records get the attention and the headlines, but the nighttime numbers are the ones that actually put people at risk. Your body treats a hot day the way you treat spending more money than you have. Your temperature rises, your heart works harder, you lose fluid through sweat. Normally the night is when you pay that debt back. Temperatures drop, your body cools down, and you wake up starting fresh. But when the night doesn't cool down, that debt never gets paid. You start the next day already behind, and the day after, that adds even more on top. That's why heat-related deaths tend to show up on the second or third day of a heat wave, not the first day. The damage builds quietly overnight, exactly like it did in that one South Korean city where the temperature never dropped low enough to give anyone's body a chance to recover. So if you're somewhere hot right now, the most useful thing you can do isn't complicated. Pay attention to your nights, not just your days. If your bedroom isn't cooling down enough for you to actually recover, that's the first thing worth fixing. And if you know someone older living alone, a short phone call in the evening might matter more than anything else you could do for them.